Good afternoon. Good afternoon. On the evening of April 3rd, 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King delivered an address at Mason Temple in Memphis, Tennessee. The address followed a weeks-long campaign in Memphis in alliance with striking sanitation workers, and it has become known as the mountaintop speech in reference to the final section where King assured his audience that although he was tired and unsure that he would live to see the rest of the journey, he was happy because he had seen the mountaintop over which lay the promised land of justice and freedom. The speech's enduring fame arose not only from Dr. King's trademark eloquence and power, but also from its tragic prophecy. Less than 24 hours later, King was murdered by a white assassin as he stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. To this day, whether in the history books, the halls of political leadership, or the holdings of the National Civil Rights Museum, Martin Luther King and the city of Memphis are forever intertwined in our collective memory. Now, we often talk about what King gave to Memphis. He gave his life, although the sustained attacks on his safety meant that his murder could have occurred anywhere. Also, as with any of the local campaigns that he worked with in the 50s and 60s, King brought to Memphis the glow of the media spotlight, the strength of a national civil rights organization, and the increase in enthusiasm that accompanied the movement's most celebrated leader. During Dr. King's time in Memphis, the struggle of the Memphis sanitation workers drew international attention and focused the tumultuous terrain of national and even global politics on this struggle happening right here. And as he did elsewhere, King brought courage and hope as he pushed for what he called the dangerous unselfishness required of those who fought for freedom and equality. He invigorated those who had been pushing for years and galvanized new allies to join in a civil rights struggle that had already cost many their lives. But we talk much less about what Memphis gave to Dr. King. We sometimes forget that the people of Memphis inspired Dr. King through their actions, energies, and insistence on the full promise of American democracy. And we don't consider the fact that, like other cities in the civil rights movement era, the story of the fight for freedom in Memphis did not begin or end with Dr. King, nor was he really at the center of a long-term struggle that began in some way when the first enslaved black people were brought to Memphis to work in the cotton trade. We forget that in Memphis, like everywhere, the struggle for justice was provoked, planned, and practiced by local people. Although this gets obscured in our memory of the movement's greatest leader, Dr. King knew this very well. So when he spoke at Mason Temple and invoked the mixture of Christian theology, American history, and global political philosophy that defined his revolutionary call for justice, he was responding directly to Memphians who gave him courage and hope at an uncertain moment. When he arrived in Memphis, King was at a crossroads. He had recently lost the support of President Lyndon Johnson and other political allies due to his opposition to the Vietnam War, and he remained a significantly unpopular figure among the American people, as he had been for the entirety of his career. He had recently come up short in the city of Chicago, where his campaign to end housing discrimination left him feeling that the Windy City was more frustrating and frightening than Mississippi or Alabama had ever been. And his increasing insistence on economic justice, from ending poverty to living wage to securing union rights, led to renewed claims that King was a dangerous and even anti-American radical. Now, these were not new attacks, of course. They had followed Dr. King since the very beginning of his career, but they led to invigorated criticism of his work and increased government surveillance of his activities. King came to Memphis because he recognized that the goals of the sanitation workers reflected his interest in pursuing the linked goals of racial and economic justice. He chose Memphis because of the everyday people who had been organizing for decades and had built powerful structures of resistance against oppression. He came to Memphis because of the coalitions that had fought for voting rights, fair wages, protection from violence, equal education, and fair treatment, and had made Memphis a model for black organizing and community building even in the worst hours of segregation and lynching. A lot of those folks, by the way, who participated in that struggle as elsewhere in the United States, were college students, including some of your predecessors at what was then Southwestern. As they so often are, people your age were on the front lines of changing the world. King chose Memphis because he saw people with the courage and the hope to resist unjust systems, to defy discriminatory laws, and to face down consistent intimidation and the constant threat of violence. During his time in Memphis, Dr. King witnessed some of the significant resistance that those local activists had faced. He saw the intransigence and hostility that Mayor Henry Loeb and the city government presented to the striking workers, and the anger provoked by the strike within many sectors of Memphis's white community. After one march down Beale Street ended in violence, King even considered leaving Memphis for good. But he was convinced to reconsider by the example of the everyday Memphians who refused to stand down, refused to sit back, and thus he returned because the dangerous unselfishness of people in Memphis was too powerful to ignore. These demands and the dangerous unselfishness of the Memphis movement didn't just give King courage, it also gave him hope. Now, to King and civil rights activists more generally, hope did not mean a false sense of security or comfort. It meant a full accounting of what was at stake in their work and a full recognition of the dangers that accompanied it. To King and the movement, hope certainly did not mean being naive. It meant a total, sustained, and critical engagement with the practice of democracy, an insistence that the United States live up to the as yet unfulfilled promise of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Most importantly, to King and the movement, hope did not mean optimism. As the historian Timothy Tyson suggests, optimism is when you weigh the potential outcomes and you decide that all things considered, things look like they're likely to work out. But hope is different, particularly the radical hope that fueled the civil rights and black power movements. As Tim Tyson notes, hope in that sense is acknowledging that it takes 200 years to fully grow a redwood tree, so maybe we should plant some seeds right now. That's the hope that King expressed when he spoke at Mason Temple and gazed out from the mountaintop. It was a hope rooted in the understanding that in Memphis and around the United States, the work would continue even when faced with great challenges, even when the desired outcomes were not immediately apparent, and even if neither Dr. King nor anyone else present that night in 1968 lived to see it come to fruition. He had seen the promised land, and he did not fear any man. Why? How could he say this? Because he had seen the proof in Memphis, Tennessee. The next day, standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, King was murdered just hours before he was scheduled to speak at another rally. Moments before he died, he called down to his friend, the Memphis band leader Ben Branch, and asked if Branch's band would play his favorite song that evening. Those became his last words. That song, the gospel classic, Precious Lord, Take My Hand, became an immediate and enduring tribute, one of many musical tributes that emerged almost instantly and continue to emerge to this day, that not only memorialize what was lost that day, but more importantly, help us remember the struggle that lives on. Thanks.
That was Dr. Charles Hughes, by the way, so if you can get into his classes, do that while you're here. My name is John Bass. I'm the director of the Mike Curb Institute for Music, and I just wanted to say a few words about the music for today's program. The piece that we started with, Lift Every Voice and Sing, is known as the African American National Anthem. In the jazz world, the band leader Art Blakey would play that to open up every one of his concerts. He was not very vocal in terms of his views or his beliefs, but that was his way of saying at the very beginning of every concert to stand in solidarity with the movement. Art Blakey's band also is a very important band for Memphis musicians. Many Memphis musicians, including James Williams, Donald Brown, Mulgrew Miller, among others, came through that band. And today, the next two pieces we have are, we're going to be joined by some just legends of Memphis music. So if you didn't know, Memphis is a music town, right? But it's even deeper and richer and more robust than any of you can even imagine. I've been doing this for 15 years now, and I learn something new about Memphis music every day. The first piece we're going to hear is by Sidney Kirk. Sidney Kirk is a graduate of Manassas High School, which is a high school here in town, which has a very rich musical tradition going all the way back to the 1920s. This piece, well, let me tell you a little about Sidney first. He's one of our local music treasures. He was the band leader for one of his classmates, somebody you may have heard of, called Isaac Hayes. So he toured with Isaac and was his band leader for many, many years. He's going to join us today, and the piece that he's going to play is called Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which is a piece that he wrote on April 4th, 1968. He's going to be joined on that piece by his daughter, Christian, who's going to come up and sing that for us. Following that, Miss Earlise Taylor is going to sing Precious Lord, the song you just heard about, which was Dr. King's final request. Miss Taylor is also a graduate of Manassas High School, has been a singer in town and all over the country for many years. She was in Dr. William Herbert Brewster's choir, who was a famous gospel composer here. She's also a tireless community advocate and a great friend of the college. So I hope you enjoy these tributes to Dr. King through music.
Screams and wails filled the air. Police came to our neighborhoods with guns drawn, batons, dogs ready. They told us that we couldn't leave, that we had to go inside. So we did. huddled around radios and televisions, hoping that something they would tell us would give us hope, would help us to understand. I mean, maybe they had made an error. You know, that happens. Maybe. God had risen people from the dead before, so maybe King too would rise. Even those of us who never marched with him, who were too afraid to talk about race matters for fear of being labeled troublemakers, even we knew that we had lost our leader. We shuddered at the barbarity of it. How could they shoot such an intelligent, dignified man down like a dog? King was jailed, beaten, insulted, and ultimately died for shining a light on the myth of innate white righteousness, for demanding decency, for demanding our personhood. And so, in remembering him, we too must challenge myths. We too must choose freedom or death. We too must dream.
Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, and let me stand. And lead me
First things first, I am so mad at John Bass for putting me on after that. That's a blessing. Good afternoon. That was so bad. Good afternoon. You know how we roll. I'm Charles McKinney, Associate Professor of History, Director of Africana Studies here at Rhodes College. Thinking about King coming up on the 50th anniversary of his assassination, a few thoughts. As the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin King approaches, the nation's attention will be ineluctably drawn once again to the words and teaching of an American who altered the course of history. However, unlike the corporate-sponsored celebrations that mark King's birth or the corporate-sponsored celebrations we saw last night, the focus this time around will be on the work and words of a veteran activist drawn to Memphis in the early months of 1968 in an attempt to confront the debilitating racial and economic inequality that dogged the lives of the city's sanitation workers. Perhaps as we reflect on King's death, we will, at least temporarily, move away from the pop culture caricature of King that has come to characterize our collective memory of him, and actually seek to understand his responses to the complex dilemmas that bedeviled American society in his lifetime and right now. Historian Tim Tyson writes that in the years after the assassination, we worked hard to turn King into a, quote, black Santa Claus. This version of King is a raceless, non-confrontational action figure that can be, Tyson continues, filled with whatever generic good wishes the occasion may dictate. In an increasingly conflict-averse society, we've grown comfortable with this new rendition of the good doctor, King 2.0. This King is meek. This King turns the other cheek. This King has dreams. Over time, we've become much less comfortable with the black Southern preacher and fierce social critic who, for all of his public life, stood against some of the most powerful forces in American society. But what happens when we have the courage to actually contend with Martin King? What happens when we take him and his words and his ministry and his politics and his philosophy seriously? What happens when we actually look at his words and force ourselves to sit with what he actually said? Perhaps one of the reasons we so often miss what some would call the radical King is because we've got a particular investment in King 2.0, the meek, simple Martin. That's the version of King who doesn't hold each of us accountable. That's the version of King that is safe. That's the version of King that we're very, very comfortable with. So, his most famous speech is the I Have a Dream speech. I would turn your attention to a speech that he gives towards the end of his life called Unfulfilled Dreams. Unfulfilled Dreams. On March 3rd, 1968, Martin King delivered what would be the final sermon at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Unfulfilled Dreams. The text for the sermon was the 8th chapter of 1 Kings in the Old Testament. The center of the story is Solomon's reflection on his father David's unsuccessful effort to build a temple to honor God. The passage is from 1 Kings 8, 17 and 19, and it reads, "And it was in the heart of David my father to build a house for the name of the Lord God of Israel. And the Lord said unto David my father, whereas it was in thine heart to build a house unto thy name, thou didst well that it was within thine heart. Whereas I Have a Dream explored the stony road that America would need to tread in order to fulfill its dream of racial equality, this sermon, Unfulfilled Dreams, explores the implications of one of life's great realities. That life, King tells us, is a continual story of shattered dreams." The juxtaposition of these two sermons, I Have a Dream and Unfulfilled Dreams, in my mind is stunning. In 1963, King's oratory reflected a searing commitment to the possibility of hard-fought social change. King is telling us in 1963, we can do this, we can win. King, that most elusive of public figures, could exhibit both an optimism that bordered on the romantic while also displaying a hard-nosed political realism. After leaving the steps of the nation's capital and commiserating with the President of the United States, King would go on to make his way to Birmingham and lead a massive protest in the nation's most segregated city, affectionately known as Bombingham. Unfulfilled Dream provides a glimpse of King's political and spiritual evolution. It also reveals an understanding of the increasing intractability of the federal government in the area of civil rights. This is what King says in this speech. Again, February 1968. He's got a very short time to live. And this is the sermon. And each of you this morning in some way is building some kind of temple. The struggle is always there. It gets discouraging sometimes. It gets very disenchanting sometimes. Some of us are trying to build a temple of peace. We speak out against war, we protest, but it seems that your head is going against a concrete wall. It seems to mean nothing. And so often as you set out to build the temple of peace, you are left lonesome, you are left discouraged, you are left bewildered. Well, that is the story of life. And the thing that makes me happy is that I can hear a voice crying through the vista of time saying, it may not come today or it may not come tomorrow, but it is well that it is within thine heart. It is well that you are trying. You may not see it. The dream may not be fulfilled, but it's good that you have a desire to bring it into reality. It is well that it is in thine heart. King's recognition that the effort to try may be the ultimate reward in life reveals the emergence of what we could call a prophetic pessimism. In this text, he eschews any reference to completion and victory. Rather, he takes solace in the effort to make change. After grappling with this text, my students often ask me, is he giving up? And I say, no, I don't think so. Matter of fact, I know he's not giving up. Rather, he is coming more fully into the notion that the work of political, social, economic, and racial transformation will continue down the generations. It will continue down to now. And that implicates us in a very direct way. One of King's mentors at Morehouse College was a man by the name of Howard Thurman. And Thurman wrote a poem, and one of the lines in that poem was, "What I do matters forever. What I do matters forever." King understood that what we do matters forever, and that's why the struggle is so very important. If we seek to take King's legacy seriously, we will have to move him from a state-sanctioned position of political neutrality and harmlessness towards something approaching the fierce social critic who stood opposed to some of the most powerful forces in American life during the middle of the last century. To be sure, we cannot project with certainty where King would stand on any number of issues. But history is a powerful guide in this regard. I think King would most definitely march with the supporters of the Black Lives Matter movement. After all, we know that he spoke out forcefully against what he called the unspeakable horror of police brutality for the entirety of the century. That's in the first half of the I Have a Dream speech. Right? We tend to focus on the second half of that speech, but we tend not to focus on the first half of that speech, the first half where he says basically we're prepared to have national protests until we get what we want. Go back and read that section of the speech. We do know that he stood opposed to the state-sanctioned killing of black folk, and that he was a master at an expansive notion of political change that encompassed the ballot box as well as the boycott and the mass march. And he did this stuff regardless of public opinion. At no point in time was it popular to sit in. At no point in time was it popular to engage in social protest. So if you're waiting for that moment where it's popular, you will die waiting. It will never be popular, but you do it anyway. So we know that he excelled at reaching across ideological differences to build relationships with those who he may have disagreed with. After all, Stokely Carmichael, the proponent of black power, and one of King's biggest critics from 1966 until his assassination in 1968, their ideological differences did not stop Carmichael from having Sunday dinner at King's house anytime he found himself in Atlanta. King believed in living with and working through difference, working through complexity. As we approach the 50th anniversary of Martin King's assassination, Memphis once again finds itself an epicenter of movement activity. Sadly, were he alive today, King would recognize many of the structural obstacles that undermine the lives of black folk in this city. He would recognize a national poverty rate among black people that is virtually unchanged from 1968. He would recognize the ongoing problem of police brutality. He would recognize the policy choices of a president and federal bureaucracy that are openly hostile to the material well-being of black folk and a whole bunch of other folk. He would certainly recognize the persistence of segregation and the shadow it casts over every aspect of life from birth to death for black Memphians. He would recognize the appalling disparities between schools populated by white students and those populated by black students. He would recognize the tortured inertia of religious and political moderates. And finally, as someone who spent the last 13 years of his life labeled a security risk, he would recognize heightened levels of surveillance perpetrated against activists and organizations done this time around in the name of homeland security. As we reflect on Martin King's legacy, let us remember him in his context. Let's confront the uncomfortable and perpetually uncompleted journeys that he dared us all to take. Let's ask the questions that he would have asked of us. Have we kept each other accountable for our mutual betterment? Have we done everything we can to make our democracy as vibrant and inclusive as possible? Do our houses of worship speak truth to power, or have they become the irrelevant social clubs that King warned us they could become? Finally, let us remember the beautifully complex, conflicted, and hopeful young man whose full potential, like that of our country, has yet to be fully realized. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Oh, come on, y'all. Good afternoon. All right. So I came this afternoon to talk to you, about us. So this is our work. You've heard the historical and personal articulations of what good and necessary work, courage, leadership look like around what we refer to as the civil rights movement of the 1960s. What I would like for all of us to think about today, as a community, is the reality that civil rights advocacy, the quest to make the lives of those of us around us better, is a long-standing practice in the United States. So we know that chattel slaves and indentured persons started the fight for freedom and equal rights long before the fight for human equity for African Americans was understood as a fight for civil rights. So I'm asking you this afternoon to think about that work, the fight for human equity, as a continuum. We have enough anthropological and historical evidence that there is no real start and certainly no ending of the work that is civil rights and human equity. And I ask that we really focus on the question, who is human? Who is human? When we're thinking about this ongoing struggle. I had the honor in the last couple of weeks of visiting the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. I went twice, a couple days apart, and much like the National Civil Rights Museum that all of you visited this fall, the African American History and Culture Museum is both heart-wrenching and celebratory. I observed in both museums the diversity of human energy, presence, perseverance, resilience, and solidarity. Those things needed to move issues of civil rights and human equity forward for African Americans, and we understand that that translates to the work that we need to do for those who are most marginalized in our country. I know this is true for our LGBTQAIP, human and intimate rights movements, women's and reproductive justice movements, DACA movements, immigration, mental health, different abilities, and on it goes. My point being, just as war, aggression, self-preservation are human characteristics, so is working to serve the greater good. Oppression is a human condition. So is solidarity. If we are to understand our nation as one founded on freedom, we might be able to problematize many of the experiences that marginalized people in the United States have. During my time at the African American History and Cultural Museum, the exhibit that I struggled and continue to struggle with most was that of the Declaration of Independence in huge letters on a wall, gold, with this eerie lighting above a giant statue of Thomas Jefferson. It read, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." All I can think when I see these words is we have come so far from that ideal. Now, instead of pursuing happiness, people all over this country pursue things like freedom, safety, education, living lives free of the threat of deportation, the pursuit of clean water. Who have we become? So we get to stand here in February 2018 and really think about liberty and justice for all. Your generation, more than any other, is truly faced with deciding and defining for all. Do something with me. Look left, look right. Where you chose to sit this evening, is there diversity there? Are the people around you exactly the same as you? There is rich difference in this room, and what I want you to consider is, are you intentionally being part of that difference? Your generation gets to decide what the country looks like over the next 10 to 25 years. Who gets to live here? Who gets to live well here? Who gets to have enough? These are the same questions that the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was asking when he visited Memphis in 1968. In King's I Have a Dream speech, he states the following: "America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity in this nation." Still, in 2018, those funds are not available to everyone in this nation. But I stand here refusing to believe that there is no hope. And I am certain that the human spirit of this country is not bankrupt. I also know that we're going to have to work for it. Work for equitable justice. Work for human conditions that resemble the ideologies that frame the Declaration of Independence. Work for environmental conditions that allow everyone in our country to have food, water, and physical health. When we lose sight of our capacity as a nation to meet the basic needs of the people around us, we must look to the moments in history that speak loudest to the just good we are capable of. I offer the Quakers, who led segments of our nation to compel emancipation, freedom for enslaved African Americans. I offer you the suffragettes, organized to achieve equal rights for women, and wave after wave of feminists have carried on the fight for equal and equitable access. And now people your age stand unified and committed to a national standard that ensures that women are able to live lives free of sexual violence. The United States has been the standards bearer for global justice. While we don't always get it right, we have organized around making our global community a place that all people might have a human experience in their lives. The United States has been known as a place where those persecuted in their own countries have come or hope for a better life. As a solidaritous people, we fought and continue to fight to make sure that everyone has the right to marriage and intimate relationships. We have mounted the stairs of our state capitals to push our elected leaders to allow people to use bathrooms that meet their needs. We push every day to save our planet, preserve our water, create a national standard for health. This should be extended to all communities. The streets of Washington, D.C., New York City, and Memphis have been filled with organized voices of those demanding a socially just reality in these United States of America. What we know in 2018 is that we get to pick the lens through which we view our country, our global community, our membership in various identity groups, our politics, our affinities, our affiliations, and ourselves. I have met very few people in the last 40+ years that were intent or intending to harm others. Most of us want the very best for ourselves, our families, our children, our communities, and the nation, but usually in that order. It takes effort and a particular kind of claiming of our impact and accountability to appreciate that in order for us to have justice, we must fight for that founding idea: justice for all, first. In the words of Hamilton, this is not a moment, it's a movement. And the moment moves, but the movement does not. If we understand the evident truths in the Declaration of Independence around inalienable rights, and we understand so many were not considered during the drafting of our foundational documents, we might be able to think together about the additional steps we must take to contribute to the greater good. Before King and long after the stage lights go out over Hamilton, we, the people, will continue to fight, not only for our own survival, but for those around us. This is one of the greatest characteristics of human beings: community. We are also privileged to have aspirational and inspirational brains, intelligences. While we can and do criticize the historical realities of how the United States came to be and continues to be, one thing is very clear. This nation came out of inspiration and a desire for human equity that still cannot be put down. What inspires you to try? What inspires you to get up in a messy world, to keep coming back at it, to keep trying to make your world and that of others simply better, livable, and on occasion, exceptional? This is our work. No human atrocity has been overcome by a single population of people. Those who sacrificed their bodies and lives to see that oppression and hate were pushed back were integral to all of the strides that we have made. No individual, no group, no identity stands alone. Our humanity is intertwined, and our histories have traveled together. It is not possible, no matter how we perform our realities, to pull them apart. So, I ask you once again, look left. Do it. Look left. Look right. You are looking at my community. This is my tribe. These are my people. This is my future. The gift of being in higher education is that each year, my faith in the human capacity to create justice and equity is strengthened because of you. You have forever in front of you, yet you continue to give your time, now at 17 and 18 years old, to make us better. This is our work. I cannot say it enough times. No single person can bring human equity and civil rights into reality. It will take all of us. So my parting thought, something I would like you to spend time thinking about. What I have come to know is that solidarity means that today you might put down your cause and pick up someone else's. But also, I know that solidarity means that I will put down my cause and I will carry yours. Until the time when we truly achieve freedom and justice for all, this is our work. Thank you.
So I'm standing between you and the ability to go to dinner. So I'll be brief. My name is Russ Wigginton. On my good days, I serve as your Vice President for Student Life and your Dean of Students. Every day, I'm an alum of Rhodes College. 1988. 20 years later. Blessed, fortunate, grateful to attend this college in this city that means so much to this world. That's where you go to school too. You thought you were choosing Rhodes College because it's a small, private, highly selective liberal arts school in a vibrant, interesting, complicated city. You did all that, but you're getting so much more, and you're going to get more than you can ever imagine. The world is coming to Memphis, Tennessee in your first year of college. You'll never forget it. 50 years ago, the first group of students of color were seniors at Rhodes. Those who I speak to have never forgotten it. But I also speak to a lot of students, a lot of majority students who were here during that time. One of them happens to be our current Board of Trustees, Carrie Fowler. Our previous Board of Trustee chair, Bill Michaelchek, was a student here in 1968. Anybody ever been to the Barrett Library? Raise your hand if you've been to the Barrett Library. If you haven't been, you get to leave early because we got to have another kind of conversation. If you've been to the Barrett Library, you've probably met a guy named Bill Short. If you haven't, you need to. Bill Short was here in 1968. Anybody have any plans or hopes, dreams to study abroad while you're at Rhodes College? There's a higher ed leader named Baron Boyd who was here as a student in 1968. So you have touch points in your midst to ask the question, what was it like to be at Rhodes College 50 years ago? On February 15th, you can ask Kobe Smith what it was like to be in that first senior class where black people could go to Rhodes but not live on campus. I have a feeling he's going to tell you a lot. One thing he's going to tell you is some of his best friends, his most memorable moments, his most challenging situations happened on this campus during that period. He's going to tell you that it's what made him a lifelong learner. He's going to tell you that it prepared him for life and the journey that he's been on ever since. He's going to tell you that when he was a student at Rhodes College and leading the Invaders, kind of the local version 50 years ago of the troublemaking young black radicals in Memphis, they had tremendous examples of support amongst his peers and amongst his faculty on this campus. I had the privilege of serving as the Black Student Association president while I was here. I don't think there were GPA minimums at that time. Otherwise, I'm not sure I would have been qualified for the position. But they let me do it, and it was a transformative experience because one of the things I got to do was to invite people like Kobe Smith and others to this campus. There's a woman who you hopefully will meet in late March, participating in some conversations about what Rhodes was like in 1968. Her name is Patricia Howard. Patricia Howard lives less than a mile from Rhodes College to this day. She's a very proud alumna. Patricia Howard came to a Black Student Association meeting because I asked her to come share what her journey was like at Rhodes College. And Patricia Howard told me and my peers that it was the most important decision she'd ever made in her life. She knew this was an excellent institution. She knew she would get a good education. What she did not realize is that amongst her classmates, she would meet so many people who would come to be so special and meaningful in her life. See, Patricia Howard thought she was going to be one of the few Black students who came to school here, couldn't live on campus, went in the classroom, did her work, and left, and went on with the rest of her life, her segregated life in Memphis, Tennessee. But what happened is she engaged, she got to know people, she shared, she dared, and special relationships were formed. So last year, when Patricia Howard retired from Girls Inc., after being connected with that organization for 50 years, see, when she was a first-year student here, that was her first internship. She never left. She interned all 4 years. They hired her. She worked for them for 50 years. How many of you are going to do that? You may not work at a place for 50 years, but how many of you are going to be passionate enough, committed enough, inspired enough to give of yourself in some meaningful way for the next 50 years? You don't have to have that figured out yet, but my wish for you is that you allow this place to touch you in meaningful ways so that you can find something you care that deeply about and make it part of your life's work and mission. What's this institution going to look like, feel like, smell like 50 years from now? None of us have an answer. But be thinking about, be working on, be preparing yourself when you come back for your reunion to share with that version of you what this place meant to you. Furthermore, for you to challenge them to make their contribution to Rhodes, to Memphis, and to greater society. Like my colleagues before me, I'm inspired and encouraged by the possibilities. What I know about Rhodes College people, the ones I knew who were here 50 years ago, the ones I know now is you will push yourself to be the best that you can be. And as part of that, Memphis, Tennessee will embrace us and we'll embrace it. And when it's all said and done, this city that for too long was labeled as the place where Martin Luther King was assassinated, it has a chance to be a place where that models what community, what progress, and what possibilities can be. I'm counting on you. We're counting on you. No pressure, but I expect you to deliver. Thank you very much. You all are dismissed.